Andrea Terzi, Catholic University and Franklin University. I have my question is to Paul de Grauwe. I have no particular sympathy for the European Central Bank, but I find your irony on the ECB being a slow mover unwarranted. It took 4 months to the Fed in 2007 to figure out how to control the Fed funds rate. And when they finally did it in December, they used a template which was the ECB template, including the introduction of the term auction facility and interest on reserves. I also don't quite understand your defining the ECB conservative in expanding the balance sheet. You showed us a chart where the liquidity in the Eurozone banking system comes down in 2012. There was not an ECB initiative. It was banks deciding to reimburse long-term refinancing operations, the LTRO, before maturity. So banks really didn't know what to do with that liquidity, and they return it to the ECB. That's one reason. The second reason is the banks need liquidity. We know that. The banks need liquidity to make payments. When they have unusual needs to make payments, the interbank rate tends to go up, and central banks have lots of ways to offset that. So it's not the quantity of liquidity that matters, but it's the price of liquidity that matters. Banks have no use of excess balances. They consider balances as hot potato, which is also described in some studies from the Fed and the ECB. And you know what's happening these days in Eurozone. When a bank expects to receive liquidity from another bank, they call the bank and say, don't send this liquidity. We pay you 0.1% so that you keep liquidity in your account at ECB.
Okay, let's just collect some of the questions. Number 2 is Philip Orestes here in the first row.
Thank you. Paul, can I ask you, unless I missed it, you haven't mentioned...
Microphone.
Sorry. Can they hear me now?
No.
Unless I've missed it, you haven't mentioned banking union and capital market union, which may be very important.
Take the other one.
And they could emerge before political integration. Thank you. Okay, better now? And my second question is political integration ever to be achieved? My question to the second speaker is, in the case of Japan, quantitative and qualitative easing, as I understand it, has become very important since March 2013 or thereabouts. And then when they increased at the same time taxes, and the whole thing didn't really work. I thought it might be very important in your analysis. And our third speaker, well, how about China in terms of the United States? China was very important in terms of the globalization era that created so much cheap imports, which was very helpful to the United States in terms of keeping inflation down, but it had also other problems. And maybe now we may have similar problems. What do you think? Thank you.
Okay, Marc Lavoie, in first row.
Yes, first question to William Garside. With respect to Japan in the 1990s, what's your final answer? Is it the firms that were refusing to borrow, or was it the banks that were refusing to lend? And to Paul de Grauwe, there's a number of our colleagues who say that the Eurozone crisis was a balance of payments crisis. So what is your take on this?
Okay, then the two ladies behind. First, the lady behind Mark Grauwe.
Hi, my question goes to Professor Garside with regards to the subdued private investment and consumption trends in Japan. So, could the factor be also due to the characteristics of investment that is going on in Japan? They could move away from investing in factories or lumpy items and instead to just improve or just into high-tech activities or services activities. So that's one factor. Or is it because Japanese firms would prefer to invest in ASEAN countries, given that they can benefit from FDI promotion policies? And so then related to private consumption, would it, I mean, I might sound like a feminist, but if, instead of firms continue to continue to offer low-pay jobs for females, why don't they just empower females, given that I read a research, but I cannot remember the name of the author, that they found that females tend to have higher multiplier effect from their consumption patterns.
My question is also to the second presenter, so it's more about the changes in the Japanese government. So my question is, so do you think the 20 years or 30 years of stagnation has need to the current nationalizationism in trends in Japan, because the current prime minister is quite aggressive over foreign policies and over their army, or it is because he is trying to focus the domestic attention to the foreign affairs, so he doesn't have that much pressure to push the economy forward? And do you think the changes in the governments over the years, because they have quite frequent changes in the government or the prime minister, like almost half a year or once in a year, so do you think that has been related to the economic stagnation, or has economic stagnation has resulted in these frequent changes in our government?
Okay. The gentleman behind you, please.
This is to Paul de Grauwe. In the beginning of our presentation, you argued that the euro crisis was not a fiscal crisis, and you show very clear, and I fully agree with you. But then if it was not a fiscal crisis, it was an exchange rate crisis, was a balance of payment crisis. That appeared where? Appeared in huge current account deficits. Spain, for instance, had a very small budget deficit, much better than Germany, and a huge current account deficit. This is an exchange rate problem. So when you come to the end of your conference, you say, well, the solution is fiscal union. Oh, I am in favor of fiscal union, but this is a non sequitur. Why don't you have proposals about the current account deficits? I know that the EU made some decisions about this, but I think that they are very mild. They permit very large current account deficits yet. And I believe that this is a kind of orthodox reasoning that says that exchange rate policy is forbidden.
Okay, two more contributions. Andrew Watt is next.
Thank you. Yes, from the Andrew from the IMK. Two questions. One, perhaps more general, but perhaps with most relevance to the Japanese case. Demography and labour supply. I've heard neither today nor yesterday very much about this issue. I wonder what role the panelists think it plays in these stagnation experiences. I mean, sometimes one reads about Japan as an optimistic interpretation that actually if you look at developments per capita, there's not so much of a problem in Japan. At least in theory, one could imagine an economy where growth is, where output is stagnant, but with a declining population, living standards are rising. I mean, what do you think of that? Does that affect the cyclical comparison as well, also to Robert Blecker's ambition? At a time when I think sort of indigenous population growth was higher, when you had an influx of women into the labour market more than is perhaps now the case. Would that affect your cyclical comparisons? There's also a slightly more, if you like, worrying or insidious idea. It also goes back to something Keynes wrote, that actually capitalism doesn't work very well if you don't have a sort of population growth pushing it over and making investment that might be a bit shaky in the first year sort of profitable in the future. And that, you know, it's like a bike that falls over more easily if you don't have that push. So that's a slightly different take on the demography issue. And just one quick, very specific point to Mr. Garside, or a question to him. Ben Bernanke made a speech in 2003 calling on the fiscal authorities and the monetary authorities to cooperate with a monetary financing of fiscal spending. I know this made quite an important impact on the debate on this subject. I gather it didn't make an important impact on Japan, that this view was sort of essentially ignored. Is Abenomics, do you see that's a throwback to this idea that essentially what's missing is sort of the central bank providing finance for the fiscal authorities to invest and raise current spending in the Japanese economy? Thank you.
Okay, last question in the first round, the green sweater in the third row.
Hi, my name is Nino Tadias, and I'm from the German Network for Pluralist Economics. And I have a remark and a question. And my remark is that I think there's too much focus on growth and a demonization of stagnation kind of in the plenary sessions. But given the ecological limits of our planet and the climate change problem, I think we shouldn't aim at growth, but more or less on stagnation, at least in the developed countries. And instead, what we should focus on is full employment and a healthy democracy and equality, but not growth in itself. Maybe our economies are dependent on growth to fulfill these objectives, but if that is the case, we should do research on why that is the case and how we can change the economic system so that we don't depend on growth anymore. This is obviously a normative statement, but I think all economics is normative in some way, and maybe there's also more need for reflection on what our true goals are, and if growth is a goal, or what are our true goals. And the question is, Jeremy Corbyn brought into discussion the QE for people idea as an alternative to the current QE program, and I'm curious on your opinion on that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I suggest we answer in the order of the presentations, with Paul de Grauwe starting. I should be on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the comments and the questions. They are very important, and let me try to answer them. There was a first question on the ECB, whether or not the ECB is a slow mover. You said the Fed needed 4 months to learn. My impression is that the ECB has needed much more than 4 months to learn a number of things. QE by the ECB started, I think, 5 years after the Fed, so it looks like in terms of slow moving, the ECB is doing a little better than the Fed. Well, your other point, I think, is more important about the movements in the balance sheets and the money base that I showed in my little graph, and indeed from the end of 2011 to early 2012, you had the LTRO, which meant that essentially the ECB was providing liquidity to the banks because the banks were in trouble because the sovereigns were in trouble, right? This was an example of the loop between the two. And at that time, the ECB did not want to intervene in the government bond markets and therefore was forced to save the banks because the banks were holding these sovereign bonds. And then when the sovereign debt crisis tended to fade away, banks reimbursed these loans that they had received. But a central bank is not a passive authority that has to just accept whatever the market outcome is. It is still a policy mistake to allow the money base to decline by €1 trillion. That's what happened. Of course, this was the result of banks repaying the loans that they had obtained from the ECB, but the outcome was that liquidity declined by 1 trillion. And the ECB did not want to use an instrument of policy that at that time was used by the Fed and the Bank of England, that is, buying government bonds in the secondary market. The ECB did not want to do it because there were objections, ideological objections within the ECB Governing Council preventing the ECB from acting. So when I'm criticizing the ECB, I of course know that all this is the result of a lack of consensus within the Governing Council of the ECB, but the very fact is that the ECB, during the second double-dip recession, failed to increase liquidity. In fact, it allowed liquidity in the market to decline dramatically. So I maintain that this is an error because the central bank does not have to passively follow what commercial banks want to do, and the central bank has another objective, that is stabilizing the economy, which is different from what commercial banks have to do. And so the ECB was a slow learner, right? It took a long time for the ECB to start what other central banks had been doing for many years. Banking union and capital union, I didn't mention it. Yeah, time is short. And of course, these are important dimensions of what has to be done in the Eurozone. Let me just say the following. First, on the banking union. What we have done up to now, of course, goes in the right direction, creating a banking union. The main element of that banking union today is the the single supervisory authority that has been given to the ECB, and some kind of resolution mechanism, but the credibility of which is very weak because there is very little money involved. So here is my point about the banking union. You can only have a credible banking union in the framework of a fiscal union. Because what you have to do in times of crisis is resolve the crisis. And you need deep pockets to do that, right? And that can only occur in the context of a fiscal union. Look at the United States. The way they deal with banking crisis. Well, this is resolved at the federal level by the federal government. It's deep pocket, right? But this is budgetary. So the banking union is another example of the need for a monetary union to be embedded in a fiscal union. And then the capital union, I'm not a great lover of capital union because not that I don't believe that it's good for letting capital free, but the arguments that have been used today by the European Commission and others that have promoted capital union are based on the idea that, well, if you do that, capital markets will be more efficient, and then you will have more insurance mechanism through private markets. And that may be true, but we also know that in times of crisis, capital markets destabilize. Right? And so in normal times, yes, then you can have stabilizing role of capital markets. But in crisis times, it's the other way around. That's what we have seen in the recent crisis. And then moving forward into a capital union without doing the necessary thing in terms of fiscal and budgetary union is asking for trouble. So therefore, I think we should be critical of capital union. And then you concluded your comment, is political union ever to be achieved? Well, let me say the following about this. We have already some measure of political union, right? There's no doubt about this, that the European Union has a dimension of political union. The only point that I'm making is that we have to go forward into more political unification to embed a monetary union. Whether that will be possible, I don't know. I'm skeptical, like you, and that's why I'm also not very optimistic about the future of the Eurozone. And then I had two questions that are very much related about, is this not a balance of payments crisis, right? Yeah, but of course, what's in a name, right? In a way, yes, in terms of the structure, it is a balance of payments crisis. But let's not forget the following. A balance of payments crisis is typical in a fixed exchange rate regime. which is a regime where central banks promise to keep the exchange rate fixed today and in the future. And then, in the future, things can happen that lead to doubts in the market whether this commitment to a fixed exchange rate can be maintained. If these doubts arise, then you get a balance of payment crisis, right? And massive movements of capital that typically have a self-fulfilling element, and that will make it impossible for the central bank that has announced such a fixed exchange rate commitment to maintain that commitment. And then you have a devaluation, or countries step out of a fixed exchange rate arrangement, things like that. That's the traditional balance of payments crisis. Of course, this cannot happen in a monetary union because there are no internal exchange rate commitments. So while the structure is similar, the trigger is different. Where does the balance of payments crisis erupt in a monetary union? In the government bond markets. That's what we have seen in the debt crisis of 2010. That's where, at a certain moment, everything will be concentrated. At some point, markets starts doubting that a particular government is capable of honoring its commitments, and then will make a move. And that means selling the government bonds, and you get a massive liquidity flow out of this country into the other safe countries of the Eurozone. And that's where, of course, you get similar elements, money flows from one country to the other. That's what you also have in a fixed exchange rate regime. You will have massive money flows from one country to the other, and that lead to movements in the balance sheets of the central banks at that moment. In the Eurozone, this leads to movements in what has been called the Target 2 system, which is taking the place of the balance sheets of the central banks. So in a sense, yes, the structure is similar, is the same, in fact. It's a commitment that is being put into doubt, and that then leads to massive movements of capital between countries that is extremely destabilizing. And then, of course, how to deal with this? Yeah. Of course, it's true. What you said is the underlying reason can be a current account deficit of a country, right? And then you have to do something about this. And this, I didn't talk about this because of time constraint. But at the same time, you have to deal with the problem, which is that we cannot have a system where all the time when there is doubt, you have massive movements that bring down governments and make it impossible for these governments to deal with recessions, for example, to stabilize the economy. And that's why I think it follows that we need a budgetary union to deal with these problems. So in that sense, we need a budgetary union, but of course this does not mean that we do not need at the same time something you mentioned, that is dealing with excessive developments in current account deficits and surpluses. And as you know, the European Commission has been given the mandate, I skipped that also in my slides, has been given the mandate to monitor these current account positions so as to make sure that these disequilibria do not appear anymore. Whether that will be successful is another matter.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Interesting questions. The question about quantitative easing and raised taxes in Japan. Well, one of my associates in Japan is a former advisor to Abe, and I can tell you that Abe did ponder and agonized about the decision to raise taxes, possibly thinking back historically to 1997. But in a sense, that has proved to be a difficulty for Japan, because the idea of the quantitative easing was to make holding cash a poor option, and that you would try to reverse deflationary expectations, increase inflationary expectations, people would spend to create generated output and growth. But there's a great deal of empirical evidence to show that as a consequence of the raised taxes, given, and I shall come on to it later, the demographic impact, a great number of people found that the incentive to spend was much reduced. And this has a continuing agony for Japan, especially when on the political agenda is formally another tax hike. But I don't think Japan will take that step in the current circumstances. The issue in the 1990s were firms borrowing or not borrowing, were the banks not lending. Well, ironically, it's a mixture of the two. The banks were lending, in a sense, to the zombie firms who technically were borrowing. But what was happening was that it ossified the dual economy because it perpetuated the existence of firms who, under normal conditions of economic shakeout, would have gone to the wall. That wasn't politically and economically acceptable. So the banks generally did not want to appear to have such an imperfect balance sheet or such non-performing loans that their solvency became an issue of public concern within Japan and internationally. And so there was this window dressing of zombie lending, which led to a recycling of debt to firms who couldn't even pay back. So the banks were actually lending to firms in order the firms could then pay out of the increased lending the interest rate they couldn't afford in the first place. So it simply institutionalized the unproductive dual economy of Japan. And that was a tragic error. In terms of female employment, I hope I understood your questions correctly. The Japanese government has made much in the press about the effort to improve conditions for women workers, because on any measure, Japan falls behind employment of women. And whereas in the past, in the high growth period, a woman was regarded as being a productive member of the rising Japanese economy. Why? Because she was at home caring for children and being there for when the man turned up at 11 o'clock at night, having been out with the corporate executives in downtown Tokyo. But she was regarded as allowing the man to be the corporate man, and she was making a tremendous personal contribution to Japanese recovery by functioning in a way that is now less acceptable to younger Japanese women. The problem is, the evidence is mounting that despite the political semblance of giving women a greater opportunity, very little is being done in the key areas so common to European experience. Where is the improvement in the tax regime? Where is the acknowledgement of childcare costs? Where is the expectation that once employed, the women will be more than just cosmetic employees? Until those fundamental issues are addressed, it's unlikely that the participation ratio will rise fundamentally. And it beggars belief why Japan, with a generation, again common to Europe, of independently minded women who want to have a lock-up-and-go life, earnings, an apartment, freedom, opportunity, an expression of individualism, that could be captured in a way that Japan captured a national consensus for growth in the aftermath of the defeat of the Second World War. The government seems to fail, in my opinion, in galvanizing layers of the Japanese economy who could help them to rejuvenate the economy. Until it does so, the stagnation will persist. Changes in government, well, leaving corruption aside, and of course you can't take Western definitions of corruption and translate them easily into the East, what is corrupt, but frequently the imbalance came from that element of corruption. But what's interesting is that the frequent changes of government in fact had a perverse effect. When the Liberal Democratic Party, which had been in power unchallenged since 1955, briefly lost power in 1993 for a few months, it so shook the political establishment that it led to an increased conservatism. So they reinforced the institutional links with the banks and the corporate sector to provide the political underpinning which they believed had worked in the past and would work again. So the irony is that the stability it quickly sought, in my view, reinforced institutional rigidity. The question of demography, I didn't mention it except in passing at the very end. I have just recently published a paper on demography in Japan compared with Europe. I entitled it "There May Be Trouble Ahead," because there's no doubt that the demographic crisis, which is common to Europe, is significantly perverse in Japan. Over 25% and rising population over the age of 65. The issue, of course, is the age imbalance. The aging population is a fiscal burden, and that poses the issue of raised taxes, therefore what happens to consumer demand. I hinted at the very end that there are investment opportunities from an aging population. The government is moving to recognize that older people are worth employing. There's a desire for employment. They bring skill and commitment and a sense of balance, which is, forgive me, often regarded as not there in the younger generation's mind. But, of course, the employment of over 70s isn't going to fundamentally shift the system. But the demographic problem is there in the sense that it constantly raises the spectre of ever-rising debt. And the older population have also a perverse effect Japan has to grapple with. Although the Bank of Japan's reflationary policy is to change deflationary expectations for inflationary expectations, older people who represent a significant proportion of total consumer demand, older people like deflation. They don't like inflation. It erodes savings. It leads to uncertainty. So the irony is that a significant portion of the spending is contrary to the official policy of the Bank of Japan. So if I could just make one point which maybe brings my responses to all the questions together, the interesting point made about do we need growth, and is growth perhaps too high a price if it means that we have to pursue policies that are self-defeating? Or can we pursue perhaps a policy of lower growth? I've reflected long on Japan's experience, and I'm coming to believe more generally that 5% growth or 6% growth, whatever figure, is not necessarily better than 4% because 5 is bigger than 4. We have to consider what are the consequences and costs. What is the point of having higher growth if we have 2-car families with double the pollution, increased expenditure on chest care and health problems, to the denouement of the younger aspiring population? So we have to get the balance between expenditure, growth, and expectations. And it might well be, this is way beyond the remit of this conference, but it might well be that the next younger generation has a different range of expectations and a different assessment of what constitutes quality of life. And that might accommodate, through technical change, lower aspirations for higher growth, which in the past, as in Japan, were pursued as a national ideal, but at high costs.
Is this on? Yes. So I think I have 3 questions to answer. And let me start with the last one, because I also wanted to address the ecological issue. And you're absolutely right to bring that up. I think in my presentation I was trying, maybe not hard enough, to emphasize employment and to argue that what has really stagnated in the United States is both employment and wages, the condition of working people. And I know I gave the usual GDP statistics, but actually part of the point was to show that it's no longer a good measure of anything. Nevertheless, there is a caution, because if you want full employment, there's a very basic accounting identity. It's the natural rate of growth formula. It says that you can only have full employment if output grows at a rate equal to the rate of population growth plus the rate of labor productivity growth. So if labor productivity continues to expand, now our population growth has slowed down a lot, but still you have to compensate for the increase in productivity. So that is a note of caution. But I think it's extremely important what the output would consist of and what the growth is for. And that's why in my discussion of policy alternatives and what the government ought to be spending on and encouraging in the private sector in terms of fiscal policy and structural policies, it's so important to emphasize environmental issues as well as infrastructure and other things. I mean, we have a system that is still incredibly dependent on fossil fuels and automobile transportation. Just cannot imagine how much worse public transit is in the United States than it is here in Europe. I mean, people here complain, but let me come to an American city. It's worse. And we have so much to do, and there's so much potential. And actually for job-creating investments in things like solar and wind energy, which we have, I mean, the fossil fuel lobby, there's these rich people like the Koch brothers who are bankrolling these nut jobs in the Republican primaries to help defend the fossil fuel industry. I mean, it's really that simple. It's the old instrumentalist theory of the state, I think. And we need to move away from that. And I know people who are working on these issues really hard, and there are opportunities in terms of solar power and how that's going to shrink in terms of both size of units where you can produce solar power and cost. And so the opportunities to invest there and to create jobs in a way that would lessen global warming instead of worsening it, those opportunities are out there, but we don't have policies that are pushing us in that direction. I also wanted to comment on the role of demography and labor supply in the American context. So we also have an aging population. It's not yet as severe, I think, as in Japan, but I don't know that much about Japan. But as a baby boomer whose generation is approaching retirement, I'm well aware of this. And it does affect the American statistics. So one of the charts I know I had a lot of graphs. I didn't include one on the employment to population ratio and another one on the labor force participation rate. And both of those have been trending down for quite some time. Since I don't have them, I don't remember the numbers or the exact dates yet, but they've been trending down for some time. But then you see these enormous accelerations in the declines after the financial crisis and the Great Recession. So, there are probably some underlying trends that the entry of women into labor force may have maxed out and maybe even have reversed somewhat. Definitely aging, because the data I had, they don't adjust for age. There's a lot of people, though, who got to be discouraged workers and technically left the labor force after the crises of the last decade, and so that's not aging. That's kind of really premature retirement. Someone in their 40s has just given up looking for a job. So demographics is part of it. One thing the United States needs to do is to come up with a rational policy for treating its immigrant population, because that is young, it is highly productive, it is vibrant, they're paying taxes if they're having a legal status where they're tracked and they're not even getting the benefits. And it's actually one way to make the population younger. In fact, it's happening, but we're not taking proper advantage of it because of, again, political issues. And China. Philip asked about China. How many hours do I have? That's a huge topic. You did see in one of my charts, I know they flashed by very quickly, that I put China joins WTO at a turning point in the manufacturing employment. And you don't just see that in the American statistics, by the way. You see it in the Mexican statistics. I don't know about the Canadian. I'll have to ask Mark later. The Mexican economy is completely turns down after 2000. It also has stagnation. And the tremendous increase in Chinese participation in the North American economy as a whole has had a huge impact. I did not want to make this a China bashing presentation, and that's not my point. But there are studies by very mainstream economists. Let me mention David Autor of MIT and Gordon Hanson of University of California, San Diego, and some other co-authors, where they've looked with very careful econometric techniques at the impacts of the shifts in Chinese export supply. So they try to isolate the exogenous component of the shifts in Chinese export capacity, not just endogenous increases in the quantity of exports. And they find enormous impact. So their estimates find, for example, over some period of time, something like a $1.5 million, $1.5 million job loss attributable just to the exogenous increase in Chinese export supply. And they also find significant and numerically important impacts on wages. And so that's the tip of an iceberg. We could have a long, long conversation about that. But I think it does relate to that. When NAFTA was created, and I'm going to give you another one of my speeches. I'll try to keep it short. The only rational idea for the thing was to make North America a more competitive economic zone to compete with Europe, which was then integrating, and Japan, which at that time was still seen as a powerhouse. And well, it never worked out, although there was a brief NAFTA boomlet in the late 90s. But it hasn't worked out. And it's actually one of the reasons for the U.S. decline. The model was going to be that the U.S. would export capital goods and intermediate goods to Mexico with some of those nice Canadian natural resources embodied. And then Mexico would do the assembly and the labor-intensive stuff, and this would be competitive in North America and globally. And it hasn't quite worked out the way it was anticipated. The job creation in Mexico has been disappointing. The immigration problem got worse instead of better. Wages are also stagnant there as well as the United States. But this is a regional issue. But now there was a point I was getting to with this. The part of the model that stopped working was that the U.S. no longer does so much of the exporting of the inputs into the Mexican economy, the intermediate goods and the capital goods for use in assembly. More and more of that now comes from Asia or Europe or somewhere else. So instead of becoming a more competitive zone, it became a more wide open zone, and they do very little value added in Mexico. They don't get the jobs. The U.S. just buys the stuff and pays for it with debt. I mean, that was the model. It's breaking down. It doesn't yet have anything to replace it. So we could go on maybe over dinner and some fine wine or German beer and continue that conversation.
Thank you all very much for your presentations and for the interesting discussion. I think this was a very good suggestion to continue the discussion at dinner with a glass of wine. So everybody's invited to move over to the restaurant.